Carl Jung discovered that deep thinkers carry a specific type of psychological pain that most people never experience. Not physical pain, not emotional trauma from events, but what he called consciousness fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from seeing too much, understanding too deeply, and being unable to turn off your awareness in a world that rewards superficiality. Picture this moment. You're at a dinner party where everyone's laughing at surface-level jokes, discussing the weather, sharing harmless gossip. The conversation flows easily around you. But when you speak, when you say something real, something honest that cuts beneath the performance, the room shifts, the laughter stops, people clear their throats, someone changes the subject, and you feel that familiar sting of being too much for the space you're in. Jung spent decades studying what happens when consciousness expands, beyond what society can comfortably handle. He discovered that the more psychologically developed you become, the more isolated you feel. Not because you're broken, but because you're operating from a completely different level of awareness than the collective around you. This isn't about being smarter than others. This is about a fundamental shift in how you process reality. And once this shift happens, Jung found there's no going back to unconscious participation in the world. But here's what he also discovered. This painful awakening serves a crucial evolutionary purpose that most deep thinkers never realize they're fulfilling. The burden of seeing. In 1913, Jung experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Most people think it was a mental breakdown, but Jung's private journals reveal something far more profound. As his consciousness expanded, normal social interaction became psychologically unbearable, not from arrogance, but from the sheer energy required to bridge different levels of awareness. But this crisis taught him the fundamental truth about deep thinkers. You're not just managing your own psychological content anymore. Therefore, you become what Jung called an unconscious material processor, automatically absorbing and filtering the emotional residue that others leak into every interaction. Think about your last team meeting. Everyone's sitting around the table discussing quarterly reports, but you're picking up on the tension between Sarah and Mark from their unresolved conflict last month. You sense your manager's anxiety about the presentation, even though they're acting confident. You notice how David deflects every time someone mentions accountability. Therefore, by the end of that meeting, you're exhausted, not from the work discussion, but from processing everyone else's unspoken emotional reality. Jung wrote in his clinical notes, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But his personal letters reveal the profound loneliness this brings. You're awake in a room full of people talking in their sleep. But that's not the most challenging part. The real burden begins when you realize you can't turn it off. You see through the performance masks people wear. You recognize the psychological projections behind their passionate political opinions. You understand how childhood wounds shape adult behavior patterns. Therefore, every conversation requires you to pretend you don't see what you see, don't understand what's really happening beneath surface interactions. The translation effort becomes psychologically exhausting. The social energy drain. When you're conscious, you become a magnet for unconscious material. Jung's patient files document this phenomenon repeatedly. Developed individuals describing mysterious fatigue after group interactions. But Jung discovered why this happens. Elena, one of Jung's patients, worked as a therapist, but experienced complete exhaustion after team meetings. Through analysis, she realized she wasn't just participating in discussions. She was unconsciously processing the unspoken tensions, projected emotions, and shadow dynamics of her entire team. But here's what Jung found most revealing. She wasn't trying to fix anyone. Her consciousness had simply become so refined that unconscious material felt like psychological static she couldn't filter out. Therefore, Jung identified what he called psychological contamination. when your heightened sensitivity serves you well in conscious environments, but becomes a liability in unconscious ones. But this creates a devastating cycle. You start avoiding social situations because they drain you. But when you do that, people assume you're antisocial or depressed. Therefore, you're forced to choose, participate, and become exhausted, or withdraw and be misunderstood. But there's another layer Jung discovered that makes this even more complex. When you've touched your authentic self, performing social personas becomes genuinely painful. Before awakening, you could unconsciously play whatever role the situation required. But after awakening, returning to persona performance creates what Jung privately called existential nausea. You're in board meetings pretending your corporate persona matters when you know it's just a mask. You're at family gatherings playing roles that stopped fitting years ago. You're maintaining friendships based on shared unconsciousness when you've outgrown the patterns that originally bonded you. Therefore, your psyche simply won't let you betray your authentic development to maintain social comfort. Jung's journals reveal his own struggle. I can no longer pretend to be the proper Swiss psychiatrist when I have seen the depths that psychiatry refuses to acknowledge. The performance feels like death. But this isn't the end of the story. It's actually the beginning of something crucial. If you've experienced this exhaustion from pretending to be someone you've outgrown, comment, "I can't perform anymore." The archetypal withdrawal pattern. Jung's anthropological research revealed something remarkable. Every culture throughout history recognizes what he called the hermit phase, a necessary stage of psychological and spiritual development. This withdrawal isn't pathological, it's archetypal. The hermit archetype appears universally because individuation requires periods of separation from collective influences. You can't integrate your shadow while others pressure you to maintain your nice persona. You can't discover your authentic voice while constantly adapting to others' expectations. Therefore, Jung realized that conscious withdrawal serves individual development, but Jung's clinical observations revealed a specific progression that every awakening person experiences. Phase 1. Recognition. You begin noticing how much energy normal social interaction requires. You find yourself needing more alone time to process experiences. You start recognizing patterns in others that you're no longer willing to enable unconsciously. But this recognition creates internal conflict because you still want to belong. Therefore, Phase 2. Selective disengagement begins. You become more discerning about which environments feel nourishing versus draining. You start declining obligations that require performing personas you've outgrown. You begin seeking others who operate from similar levels of awareness. But this selectivity often looks like rejection to those you're pulling away from. Therefore, Phase 3, integration and return occurs. After sufficient solitude, you re-engage with social environments, but from a fundamentally different position. You're no longer trying to fit in or maintain approval. You're offering authentic presence to those ready to receive it. But you return changed. You can participate consciously without losing yourself. Jung's case studies reveal something crucial. Everyone who undergoes genuine spiritual awakening follows this exact pattern, but they return with something society needs but can't yet recognize: the invisible contribution. Dr. Heinrich Weber, one of Jung's patients, disappeared from academic life for 18 months. Colleagues assumed he'd suffered a breakdown, but Jung knew better. Weber had experienced a breakthrough. In solitude, he integrated insights about the human psyche that would have been impossible while maintaining his academic persona. But when he returned, he revolutionized his field. Only after the necessary withdrawal period allowed complete integration. This reveals Jung's most important insight about conscious withdrawal. It's not abandonment of society, it's preparation for authentic contribution. But the contribution happens differently than most people expect. Jung's term border dwellers describes returned hermits perfectly, present in society but not consumed by it. They've learned to engage without losing themselves, to contribute without compromising their authenticity. Therefore, they operate from conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. Border dwellers might create businesses prioritizing employee well-being over profit maximization. They develop art speaking to soul depths rather than surface entertainment. They offer healing focused on root transformation rather than symptom management. They build communities based on authentic connection rather than shared unconsciousness. But most importantly, they demonstrate through their presence that alternative ways of being are possible. Jung's correspondence reveals something fascinating. Conscious people become selectively visible after integration. They're invisible to those seeking unconscious validation, but clearly visible to those ready for authentic connection. Therefore, they exist on society's margins, while being deeply connected to others on similar developmental paths. Jung's research into group dynamics showed that consciousness operates contagiously, but only when fully integrated. Half-conscious people often create more unconsciousness by trying to wake up others prematurely. But fully individuated people naturally transmit awareness simply through their presence. They're not preaching or pushing, they're simply existing from a different level of awareness that makes alternative ways of being visible to those ready to see them. Comment below if your presence alone seems to make some people uncomfortable. I don't try to wake people up, they just sense something different. The collective evolutionary purpose. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This painful journey isn't just about individual development, it serves collective evolution. Jung prophesied that humanity would face collective challenges requiring widespread psychological maturation. He believed individuals who withdrew during stable times to develop consciousness would become essential guides during periods of collective transition. We're witnessing this prediction now, but the mechanism is more subtle than most people realize. Jung's analysis of cultural change identified that conscious withdrawal creates what biologists call evolutionary pressure on unconscious systems. When awakened people stop participating in dysfunctional patterns, those patterns either evolve or collapse. But this happens gradually, system by system. Organizations lose their most innovative employees to more conscious alternatives. Relationships based on unconscious patterns dissolve when one person refuses to participate unconsciously. Political movements lose supporters who see through their psychological projections. Therefore, this creates selection pressure for more conscious alternatives to emerge. This transmission happens through what Jung called morphic resonance, changes in consciousness that spread through communities without direct teaching or persuasion. Your individual development contributes to collective development in ways you may never directly see, but there's an even deeper mechanism at work. During withdrawal periods, conscious people serve as humanity's research and development wing. They're pioneering relationship models that prioritize authenticity over performance. They're creating economic approaches that serve life rather than exploitation. They're exploring healing modalities, addressing root causes rather than symptoms. They're developing lifestyle approaches, sustaining both individual and planetary well-being. Therefore, when larger culture becomes ready for these innovations, the prototypes are already tested and available. Jung's research into group dynamics revealed that consciousness awakening follows what researchers now call critical mass dynamics. You don't need everyone to awaken for collective transformation to occur. You need a sufficient number of individuals operating from genuine awareness to create a tipping point. Therefore, the people quietly stepping back from society to do their inner work aren't abandoning the collective. They're part of a natural process preparing humanity for its next developmental phase. But Jung understood something most spiritual teachers miss. Transformation happens over generations. The parents who withdraw to develop consciousness raise children who grow up assuming that authentic living and conscious relationships are normal possibilities. Therefore, these children become adults who create institutions, relationships, and cultural norms based on psychological maturity rather than unconscious patterns. Today's hermits are preparing the foundation for tomorrow's conscious culture. But Jung's clinical approach emphasized that each person must choose their own relationship with this collective awakening process. Some are called to withdraw and develop consciousness in solitude. Others are called to transform systems from within. Still others are called to build bridges between conscious and unconscious communities. Therefore, none of these paths is superior to the others. The collective needs individuals operating consciously from all positions, hermits developing wisdom, culture workers transforming institutions, bridge builders facilitating communication, and pioneers modeling new possibilities. But there's a crucial distinction between healthy and unhealthy withdrawal that every deep thinker must understand. The shadow of spiritual development. While Jung validated conscious withdrawal as necessary, his clinical observations also documented its shadow aspects. Spiritual awakening can become spiritual bypassing when used to avoid rather than engage with the full spectrum of human experience. Jung's psychiatric practice identified spiritual inflation as one of the primary dangers facing awakening individuals. When people mistake psychological development for superiority, they use consciousness as another form of ego protection rather than genuine transcendence. But the warning signs are subtle. You might believe you're too evolved for normal human challenges like grief, anger, or fear. You might use spiritual concepts to avoid taking responsibility for practical life areas like finances, health, or relationships. You might develop contempt for people operating unconsciously instead of compassion. You might become addicted to being the most conscious person in any room. Therefore, you're using withdrawal to avoid feedback that might challenge your self-image. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This includes accepting that you're still human, still learning, still capable of unconscious behavior, even after significant development." But there's another shadow pattern Jung identified. Jung's therapeutic notes document cases where people became addicted to the safety and control of solitude, using withdrawal as avoidance of the challenging reality of human relationship. He termed this hermit neurosis, mistaking isolation for enlightenment. But healthy withdrawal energizes you for eventual re-engagement. Unhealthy withdrawal becomes progressively more isolating and leads to depression, anxiety, and disconnection from your own humanity. Therefore, Jung's clinical experience revealed that genuine individuation always leads back to human community, but from a more authentic position. If your awakening is making you less capable of love, connection, and service, something has gone wrong in the process. The integration challenge. Jung's therapeutic records show that withdrawal prepares you for a fundamentally different kind of social engagement, one based on authenticity rather than performance, service rather than need, contribution rather than consumption. But the re-entry process requires specific skills. When you're ready to re-engage after integration, Jung's treatment protocols recommend a gradual process that honors both your development and others' readiness for authentic connection. Therefore, you start with low-stakes interactions where you can practice being authentically yourself without pressure to perform or fix anyone. This might include conversations with Strangers who have no expectations about who you should be. Volunteer work where you can contribute without needing approval. Creative communities where authentic expression is valued. Professional contexts where your unique perspective adds value. But there's a crucial shift that must happen first. Jung's case studies reveal that post-integration social engagement feels completely different because your motivation shifts from getting something, approval, validation, belonging, to offering something, presence, wisdom, authentic connection. Therefore, this shift removes anxiety and performance pressure because you're no longer dependent on others' responses for self-worth. But Jung discovered that the real test of integration isn't whether you can engage authentically. It's whether you can sustain your consciousness while participating in imperfect systems without becoming overwhelmed or compromised. Jung's final insight about conscious re-engagement is learning what he called conscious participation without absorption. This requires clear boundaries about what you will and won't participate in unconsciously, skills for offering authentic presence without becoming overwhelmed by others' unconsciousness, support systems with others sharing your commitment to conscious living. Therefore, you remember that your primary responsibility is maintaining your own consciousness, not awakening others. This creates what Jung called morphic resonance, changes in consciousness that spread through communities without direct teaching or persuasion. Your individual development contributes to collective development in ways you may never directly see. The call to authentic living. If you've been feeling the pull to withdraw, to step back from unconscious social participation, Jung's research suggests you're recognizing that humanity needs people who've done their inner work to help navigate the challenges and opportunities of our collective awakening. Your stepping back isn't avoidance of life, it's preparation for a more authentic version of it. You're not abandoning humanity, you're developing something humanity needs, but doesn't yet know how to create. Therefore, Jung discovered that consciousness withdrawal is temporary recharging that allows awakened individuals to return and offer authentic connection. But Jung discovered that the path of the conscious individual is ultimately about trust, trusting the timing of your development, trusting that your authentic journey serves something larger than yourself, trusting that your individual awakening contributes to collective healing in ways you may never directly witness. Whether your path involves withdrawal, re-engagement, or something uniquely your own, Jung's work reveals that deep thinkers aren't suffering from a disorder, they're participating in humanity's gradual awakening to more conscious ways of being. Therefore, the pain you feel isn't punishment for being different. It's the growing pains of human evolution. The world needs your depth, your questions, your refusal to accept surface-level answers, not the filtered version of you, not the toned-down version, not the agreeable smile-on-demand version. It needs your authentic presence, your willingness to see clearly, your courage to live consciously, even when it's uncomfortable. Remember that moment at the dinner party when your authentic words shifted the room? That wasn't you being too much. That was consciousness meeting unconsciousness. And in that moment, you gave everyone present a glimpse of deeper possibility, whether they were ready to receive it or not. Jung believed that today's deep thinkers become tomorrow's wisdom guides. Your individual journey towards psychological maturity isn't selfish. It's essential preparation for the role you'll play in humanity's collective awakening. Therefore, trust the process, honor your authentic path, and know that your consciousness matters more than you realize. If you're learning to trust your unique developmental timing, comment, "I honor my authentic path." If this journey through Jung's insights resonated with something deep in your experience, let's continue exploring these psychological territories together. Like this video if you felt the weight of consciousness fatigue or the pull toward authentic withdrawal. Comment below with one word that describes how this exploration made you feel right now. Subscribe to stay connected with others walking the path of conscious development. And remember, in a world that often misunderstands depth, you'll always find understanding here. Your consciousness isn't a burden to bear alone. It's a gift you're preparing to offer the world when the timing is right. Thanks for joining this exploration of what Jung called the privilege and burden of becoming who you truly are. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.